Hey guys, welcome to our comprehensive overview of Soren Kierkegaard's Repetition. This is Luke Johnson.
I'm CJ. Welcome to this program.
Yeah. So today we have the pleasure and the curse of covering this text. I say that it is a pleasure because, as far as I can tell, there isn't anything in audio about repetition out there. If it did exist, I believe I would have found it. The curse is that I feel like such an onus to get this book right, and I'm so scared that I'm going to mess it up. We just had dinner and we talked a little bit about it. That's the first time I've ever really talked in depth with someone about Soren Kierkegaard's Repetition. So it's a little scary. It's a little bit of a tightrope walk for me.
So if it's a consolence, you said the same thing about the present age. And I thought we had a really good discussion. So I think we just have to see where it goes. And like Christopher Hitchens says, when you publish a book, it's an education that lasts a lifetime. When we publish this video, I think it's going to be an education that lasts a lifetime. We could get really good people to come on and say, wait, I think that part of the work isn't right.
Yeah.
And then they will help us, and then we'll have this dialogue, and then we'll all have a better view of repetition of Kierkegaard. So I think that's reassuring, at least. Even though we are stumbling in the light, or in the dark, rather, I think we will do well here.
Yeah, I would just say, anyone that's listening to this, I want you to not take what I say to be gospel, and I want you to check what I have to say in this podcast against what you find in the text yourself and against secondary sources. The only thing that I've consulted for this is the book itself, and it's a very convoluting book. I actually think Fear and Trembling, the podcast that I did with Jordan yesterday, was conceptually more convoluting than this book. But this book, the organizational structure of this book, I thought was very difficult to make heads or tails of. At least it was for me, someone who doesn't read a lot of literature. And this is one of the more literary works of Soren Kierkegaard I've ever read.
Do you think that's probably why there isn't a lot of resources on the internet? Is that it's a convoluted sort of book in the sense that you're not really sure who is saying what and what Kierkegaard exactly endorses, if there is any idea to endorse?
Yeah, I mean, I think it gets overlooked. It's typically paired. So if I can give a little bit of background for it, is that Repetition, Fear and Trembling, and Three Upbuilding Discourses came out on the same day in 1843. So essentially, Kierkegaard dropped a triple album. Can you imagine dropping three?
Oh, it's like Sandinista, right, for the Clash, where they just released a 3 LP album.
Which is really incredible to think about. And he wrote these under different pseudonyms. I'm not sure who wrote what he wrote under for Three Upbuilding Discourses. That might be a direct signing. I'm not sure. I'll have to go back and check that. But Fear and Trembling is Johann de Silencio. Repetition is written under the pseudonym Constantine Constantius. I believe that's how you say it. I'm not exactly sure.
Well, we're going to be on a first name basis for today.
CC. Yeah. So, and what's interesting about this pseudonym is I think it's kind of a wink and a nudge of something that is to come. I was telling CJ earlier, I think the reason why he chose this pseudonym rather than just using Johann de Silencio again is that we're going to be talking about repetition. We're going to try to figure out what Kierkegaard means by repetition, which is by no means easy to distill. But there is alliteration here with Constantine Constantius. There's the CC. So there's the repetition in the name. And then in addition to that, I believe that something about repetition is going to involve constancy, being constant. And again, we see that with Constantine Constantius. So I think that might be part of the reason. I'm sure someone has written an entire book why Soren Kierkegaard chose this pseudonym, but that's my best guess of why he picked this. Did you find anything significant about this pseudonym? Were you interested in it at all?
I have a question for you in regards to the pseudonyms, because we seem to surmise what the pseudonym is after we read the book. If you looked at that pseudonym before you read it, would you have had some kind of conclusion that you did now that you just told me?
I attributed that, just as I didn't understand when I was reading Fear and Trembling why Kierkegaard chose Johann de Silencio. Like, after I read Fear and Trembling, I'm like, oh, now I get it.
It might be a little more obvious with repetition, because repeat constant, haha, that's kind of funny, you're repeating something, it's constant. I don't know.
I'm kind of dim, man. Like, it takes me a while to pick up on things.
No,
like, I think that maybe I just wasn't in on the joke at first.
I mean, isn't it like the Hemingway thing where he talks about the old man in the sea and he said, look, the dolphins are fucking dolphins, the sharks are fucking sharks, there's nothing really crazy or thematic about it, it's just what it is, where maybe we are getting a little too into the pseudonyms, and we don't know how Kierkegaard even attacked the pseudonyms anyway, whether it might have been something he did at the end of the work, or it was something, like you said, that maybe he had these sort of
I think he made
thoughts about it, and he said, okay, well,
we'd have to look at the... I wouldn't be surprised if he had it all mapped out at a much earlier stage. I'd be interested in reading my point of view as an author, or looking at his journals and seeing like how much like pre-planning he did on this stuff. But I think it is important to point out, why would he use a pseudonym for this at all? Like, why wouldn't this be a book that he would directly sign? And I think we go back, if we understand, this book falls within Kierkegaard's first authorship. And typically the way there's a dual authorship within the first authorship, and things that are more philosophical in nature I usually attribute to a pseudonym, and things that are more religious in nature are more of a direct signing. But this book is very strange because there is a philosophical streak in it, but it's really kind of more of a novel. And it really sort of portrays, and I was thinking about it, it's almost like Kierkegaard's having a conversation with a younger version of himself. There are these interlocutors of Constantius has this conversation with a young man. There's a series of correspondences about, well, we'll talk about what it's about, but it essentially involves a woman. But I view this as sort of a more aesthetical work that gets inside the romantic, emotional mind of Soren Kierkegaard, and at least on one level is confessing to Regina, like, why he broke off the engagement. Now, there's a lot of other levels this book is operating on, but primarily it seems like to me like that this book is acting as a repository for all the psychological noise that led to the ending of the engagement that he had with Regina. That's how a big part of this is, but there's also a big philosophical thing that we need to address too. I don't know, the question might be like, what's the significance of Kierkegaard in this relationship with the young man, and as Constantius, what's the significance of it? Why is it important to us for us to understand his psychological atmosphere in this relationship that affected him so profoundly?
Do you think perhaps that the pseudonyms act as a way for Kierkegaard to have a dialectic with himself? Because we do think of dialectics as we're going to take opposing views, these abstract views, and we're going to bring them together or siphon them through taking bits and pieces and discarding other pieces of such ideas. Could these pseudonyms, in a sense, be the abstract versions of ourselves or of Kierkegaard, and he is having a dialectic with himself and trying to prod and poke them until he comes up with this idea? I think what we mentioned before, the big idea of the existential religious individual.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think he's probably doing it for himself. Like, I'm sure, like, I mean, look, I think about, like, when I'm writing a song or when I'm putting together a lecture or something like that, I have to, like, unload a lot of what's going on within my personal psychology in order for me to transcend and build the next part. So I wouldn't be surprised if he's just sort of, like, if maybe this had its genesis in some mad journaling or whatever, and he just had to clarify why he did what he did to himself. But I also think he's trying to explain to Regina what was going on, and maybe he's trying to send a message to the public at large who's judging him, who excoriate him for how he conducted his romantic life. But I think there might be some significance, and I think someone ought to do this, is to try to go through his perspective on this romantic relationship and how it may sort of affect what the ideal existential man looks like. Like, if there are cues there, or if it's just too much of an inchoate, romantic, emotional mess for us to really figure out what we ought to be from it.
I like the latter portion because I think we can't really get at what he thought of this romantic relationship. I think that's the point of maybe that's another point of all these pseudonyms, is that he's trying to divert and to keep hidden and to remain transparent as a figure.
Yeah. I mean, totally. We can speculate a lot about that. Maybe it'll become more obvious to us as we sort of progress through the text. So we should set up kind of what's going on in this book in terms of the theme.
Sure. So you mean the narrative or the ideas?
The narrative. So let's just talk about the narrative a little bit.
Sure.
So a large part of this book is concerned, like I've already talked about, it being this correspondence between CC and the young man. And this young man is debating about whether or not he's going to go through marriage with a young woman. It sounds exactly like what Kierkegaard experienced. And I believe he either seeks out CC's advice about what he should do because this young man doesn't seem like he can make the ethical commitment to marriage. There's something that's holding him up. And then Constantius makes this recommendation, this plan for him about how he should go about his business, like tricking and I'm really not clear on all the details. Like if like he wants the young man to give her the illusion that he's interested in somebody else, and then if she comes back, but I don't know. I'm confused in all those details. But ultimately, she ends up leaving the young man and marrying somebody else, not unlike what Regina did with Kierkegaard after they broke off the engagement.
And to preface that, I think I have a different story. Maybe.
Yeah.
But let's see. I think we'll combine.
Clarify it for me because I had trouble because of the unorthodox nature of this. Like I was describing it to you earlier, the way that this book unfolds, this novel unfolds, I felt like I was time hopping all over the place, and I didn't understand. Sometimes I'd get confused when the young man was speaking or when CC was saying, well, if I were in your shoes speaking. And so it almost to me was like a Memento kind of story where timelines were meshing or like that movie, The Fountain, where like it goes in between three different timelines. So it was very hard for me to, I would lose track of who was talking at different points. And I'm not sure it really matters. What do you think? How do you understand the basic narrative of this philosophical novel?
Sure. So first we have the meeting between the young man and Constantine. And from what I gathered of that was that the young man told Constantine that he was in love with this woman. I'm not sure if he was saying he was going to get engaged with this woman, but he was waxing poetic about this woman to Constantine. And Constantine was surprised himself, saying, oh, well, maybe it was just something about me that lets these lunatics divulge all of this personal business to me. But this happens, and they correspond a while, and Constantine knows this man is in love with this woman. And then all of a sudden, like you just said, he falls out of love, and he doesn't know what to do. And that is where, like you said, Luke, Constantine tries to give solutions to this problem. But this idea of the young man, falling in love and then falling out of love, perhaps is a example for Constantine to even think or to write a book about repetition and whether it can even be achieved within this world.
Yeah, I think right, like this, it does present a sort of an occasion to revisit an earlier part of his life and we'll have to get a clarification of what exactly repetition is. And I think that's probably what we're going to be really preoccupied with throughout the primary aspect of this podcast. And I think the way that Kierkegaard begins to help us understand what it means to repeat, to engage in repetition, is to contrast it with what it is not.
Yes.
And he does this a lot. Like in Fear and Trembling, he uses these failed Abrahams, these Abrahams that don't really comport with the actual biblical interpretation or the biblical story of Abraham to show what faith is not. And one of the things that we know that repetition is not, and these are the big philosophical things that Kierkegaard is trying to communicate, is that recollection is a form of knowing and being that can be traced back to the Greeks. And specifically, he has in mind, say, I don't know, Socrates and his dialogue with the slave boy and the Meno, where Socrates is being like, look, this 14-year-old slave boy knows geometry, knows mathematics. Therefore, he's recollecting some knowledge that's been implanted in his soul from the beginning. And then from there, you can make this inference that the soul is immortal.
And to continue with that, we have the idea of the oral tradition too.
Yeah.
Which is all about memory. We even have Plato condemning books because he says, well, if you have books, you're not going to want to remember. You're not going to want to recollect.
Yeah, recollecting was a big deal in ancient culture. Like, I mean, the Odyssey, right? Like, that was passed down from generation to generation by oral tradition, right?
And that story was all about trying to remember the return, as Italo Calvino writes about, where Ulysses had to remember his story so he could tell everybody. He had to remember how to get back, and other characters had to remember the story of Ulysses.
I wonder what they would think about me using like video to make sure that I crystallize these thoughts somehow, because I can't really hold it all in my head. You know?
I think Plato is rolling in the ideal somewhere.
He's
not even the gravy.
I'm very okay with that. So there's those aspects of recollection, right? So what else also? So if you're recollecting, you're usually within the sort of finite sphere of human intelligence, of eminence, right? Not right. So who also like kind of takes on a sort of an eminental recollecting sort of form for Kierkegaard is going to be Hegel. And Hegel engaged in this process that I guess at that time was called mediation, where he would try to take two terms or entities and find a third term. So it'd be thesis, antithesis, and then some sort of synthesis. And this is sort of the limits of what can be done within the eminental realm. And then if we take it away from philosophy, you know, if we're talking about Socrates and Hegel being forms of recollection and trying to understand ourselves, understand the universe through recollection, if we get it more on the personal level, he talks about how there is a fundamental unhappiness, happiness blend in the process of recollecting romantic relationships.
So that could be a diagnosis for the young man who
totally
falls in love and then he remembers maybe the love that he had, maybe the poetry and the wild romance that he had in those maybe first couple weeks or days, and then all of a sudden it doesn't happen that way one day and he feels like he's fallen out of love.
Right. Like there's going to be, like you think about it, like if you think back on like, if I think back on my failed relationships, like I remember like a good time I had with him. I'm like sad and then I recollect and I'm happy a little bit, and then I recollect how that's like something, that's a ghost. That's something I can't grab onto and make real again. It's gone. Like, it's totally gone. It's not real anymore. And I can't revisit that. I can't repeat that. It's recollected, and there's sadness endemic to it. I wonder if Kierkegaard's trying to say that when we do philosophy and try to recollect that way through this in the immanental realm, if there's a sadness in that. And I know from his other works, he does think there is a form of, you know, intellectual despair, because ultimately our minds are finite and we can't get at the infinite. Like we have conceptual limitations. Like we can't, science is ultimately going to be an approximation. History is ultimately going to be a social construction. Philosophy is an incomplete system because it can't conceptualize spirit. There are lots of reasons why philosophy is not going to make us feel complete as existential beings.
I'm wondering if you can go further, or if maybe we can have a conversation, a quick little aside about recollection in regards to philosophy and science. And you mentioned Hegel, and I suppose I'm still trying to wrap my head around the idea of Hegel being a recollector, or did he think that it was all something that was just innate in us, or is that maybe his idea of the absolute? I'm just throwing out terms where maybe it was something that transcended.
Well,
I'm not really sure.
Truthfully, I'd be I would be trespassing into territory. I wouldn't be doing anybody a service for me to speak about how Hegel envisioned his what he believed that he was doing. I think there are a lot of Hegelians who, and it depends on the Hegelian you talk to, like, but I think there are a lot of Hegelians who think that they are merely an instrument of something much larger than themselves. They are just like the dialectic unfolding within them. Sure. So it's not so much I don't know if it would be so much from the Hegelian perspective. It's not so much that it's a backward-looking thing, but like there is a current of philosophical thought that is flowing through them. Like they are essentially an agent of divine reason of sorts. Mm-hmm. But that would be a massive oversimplification, and I know there are Hegelians out there who probably would rake me across the coals.
So let's take general philosophy or science then, for instance. Are you maybe coming to the conclusion that science or philosophy is recollection in the sense that we take past ideas or past observations? You say take something like the scientific method, and then we make conclusions off of those in some way?
Yeah. I mean, especially, I think it becomes most apparent with history. I think it becomes most apparent with history. History is a lot like science. It's empirically verified. But what's the old Churchill quote? Like, is that history is defined by the victors or something like that?
Or that science is not a system that is above human limitations. It's based on human limitations.
Yeah, it's constantly being revised. And models that we imposed upon science then get thrown off in favor of new paradigms and whatnot. But like history, you could tell the history of the United States. Like there's a history of the United States that we're taught in school, and then you can have parallel alternative accounts of history from feminist perspectives, from minority perspectives, from global perspectives. It really depends on who's writing the book, and hence why there's this backward-looking glance to life.
I love this because within these systems, especially I think of science, but most, maybe not most, but some, think of science as something that can be repeated, that the scientific method is perfect and can be repeated over and over and over again, and that method will not change at all. But the conclusion we're coming at is that it does each time, or to think that...
I don't know if the method changes.
The person changes, and the time changes, and the conditions change.
New evidence comes forth that will cause a revision of the theory. But you're getting into really some meta-science questions about, is there a different scientific method for different types of science? Like when you're doing hyper theoretical physics, is there a different scientific method at those fringes than say like when we're just talking about plain old law of gravitation?
Right. I think maybe
because there's some science that's like more probabilistic in nature, and then there's stuff that's more rigorously mathematic. That's kind of a philosophy of science conversation. But there is a prognosticating element that projects out into the future.
Yes. I think we're trying to make science seem eternal when it is actually something that is man-made, and therefore
it's constantly in flux. It is constantly in flux. Our understanding of the universe, and I think any scientist who is really a scientist will understand that like everything is up for amendment. Now there are certain scientific truths that are more established empirically than others. Mm-hmm. But given the history of science, you have to be prepared for overthrows. Like Newton's classical mechanics prevailed for I don't know how many centuries, and then they started messing around on the quantum model and trying to understand.
Even Einstein was relativity, and then all of a sudden quantum theory, and then Einstein is famous saying, says God doesn't play dice. What do you mean? And then all of a sudden God plays dice, and okay, what is quantum theory now? And then who knows what that will get usurped by.
Well, they say so. You've got classical mechanics like working on one level, as far as I understand it, and then on a macro level, and then on a micro level, they've got quantum mechanics. And so, the idea, right, and the thing that everybody is all fervent about is that somehow both these paradigms will be superseded in string theory in some way, which I don't know a lot about.
So that could be the new thing.
Yeah, it could supplant them all.
So what we're getting at here, Luke, then, is that these systems do not support repetition. And I think we need to get at the point of what repetition is, and maybe relate it to the story, because Constantine, we do have this story here, but then after the story is introduced, Constantine does give an account of how he tries to find repetition in the aesthetic sphere.
Yeah.
Of going to a play in Berlin, or going to Berlin as he did when he was younger, and trying to recreate the same experience that he had. So I think maybe we have to explore what repetition in the beginning is, or what maybe we found the definition was.
Right. Well, I think there's one quote that we should keep in mind to sort of guide our conversation here.
Yeah, shoot.
This is page 131. Repetition and recollection are the same movement, except in opposite directions. For what is recollected has been is repeated backwards, whereas genuine repetition is recollected forward. So that's confounding enough. But the thing is about recollection is that there's always some restlessness. There's always like this phantasmagorical hope to it, whether or not you're like clinging to an old relationship or something like that. Or there's always this uneasiness of discovery where like you can somehow solve the riddle of the universe through mathematics or science. But with the repetition that Soren's going to be talking about, you truly are just sort of dwelling in this particular moment, and there's a sense of satisfaction in this moment that recollection could never offer under the views of antiquity and science and other paradigms. And so I think we have to ask ourselves, like, what exactly does that mean? Like, in the context of this story, there are different types of repetition that are put forth. You mentioned one. So Constantius tries out one form of repetition, and I put it in mind. I called it aesthetic repetition. Do you want to tell the story about what he does, or what?
Sure.
And I can relate some of my own personal life to this.
So
too.
when we talk about the aesthetic, we're talking about art and beauty. Well, we're talking about art here, and
we're talking about like kind of the pleasurable domains,
Yeah.
things that we typically find pleasure from, and that can be carnal desires, that can be food, that can be music, that can be philosophy, like. All of these things can have an aesthetic dimension to them.
So Constantine wants to recreate that
experience. What is he
in
recreate?
going to a play in Berlin?
Right, he retraces his steps. He repeats his steps in Berlin.
Sure, and I'm not really sure of whether this was one night that he went to Berlin and then he said, I'm going to try and do this the second night, or whether he did go as a child. But we know that he had an experience at this play, and it was quite enjoyable, where he was the only person in his little booth.
He had a good seat,
and he had a good seat looking down at this one gorgeous woman, and she didn't really look back at him, so he could just survey her without any kind of awkwardness occurring, and it was just this glorious experience. So then he tries it out again. And sure enough, there's no booth that is not empty. He has to move himself around all of these people and sit down. And he looks for the girl. The girl isn't there. And the play doesn't give him as much excitement as it did. So we have this yearning from Constantine about recreating a aesthetic experience, which is the play, which is the pleasure of the farce, the pleasure of this woman, the pleasure of irony, humor that is happening in the work. And
it's not just those things. There are like all these little details of Berlin that he tries to recreate. Mm-hmm. There's one interesting story. There's some man who tells him about, like, the first time he was in Berlin, this man tells him about why he ought to remain a bachelor, and he was totally convinced by the explanation about why he ought to remain a bachelor. And then he gives an aesthetic justification for marriage, and he said, I was just as convinced this time. And he ultimately ends up concluding on this with this. I have this nice quote from page 177. When this had repeated itself several days, the trip to Berlin, I became so furious, so weary of the repetition, that I decided to return home. My discovery was not significant, and yet it was curious, for I had discovered that there simply is no repetition and had verified it by having it repeated in every possible way. So he tries to relive every aspect of it, and it's not satisfying to him. This aesthetic repetition of the trip to Berlin says that you can't go through the same river twice. This Heraclitus view that everything's constantly changing. I had this experience happen to me. I studied at Oxford when I was 20 years old. Was an Anglophile, all that time in between. Had an opportunity a couple years ago to go back to England, and I retraced my steps, and like it just was an empty experience for me. What was one of the most significant experiences of my life studying in England, when I studied there in my 30s, like it just wasn't the same. Everything had changed, despite the fact that I was doing all the same motions all over again.
It almost sounds like what Constantine said.
Yeah.
Where it's a repetition in the non-repetition.
Right. So I think we'd say that this is not a legitimate form of repetition. So then what else is left? What are the only other sorts of repetitions that are available to us? Now there's this repetition of the commitment to marriage, to an ethical repetition. And that this somehow will be better than sort of constantly living in aesthetic categories and recollecting.
And we get this viewpoint, or we get this struggle within the young man in the letters of correspondence he gives to Constantine about this struggle. I was wondering if you could give a little more detail about this struggle that he has in his head, and maybe more about the ethical repetition, if we can find anything.
To be honest, I didn't understand it well enough to like say for certain I thought that the young man was particularly clear about his situation, because like the reason why I found this to be tough, because he's going to then analogize himself with Job, and I think this is where we can talk about a religious repetition and ultimately what Kierkegaard wants to talk about. But what's interesting is that Kierkegaard wrote these two massive volumes called Either Or. People are probably pretty familiar with Either Or because Elliott Smith made a record called Either Or, and that's pretty famous. People talk about the Either Or. There's this passage from Either Or. It's like, this is marry or do not marry. You will regret it. Like kill yourself, don't kill yourself. You will regret it. Like do this, do that. Like you will regret it. And in that, I think what Kierkegaard is trying to do there is there's a dialectic between the aesthete, who's represented as this character A, and this representative of the ethical, Judge Wilhelm, where he's trying to show A that he needs to stop his aesthetic ways and he needs to come over to the ethical. But ultimately, there's a sense of sadness in this repetition of ethical existence. You can sense that Kierkegaard thinks that there is a limitation to that ethical personality that is embodied by Judge Wilhelm. I will say this, in other books, it's clearer to me what the limitations of the ethical repetition are. Specifically, and I talked about this yesterday with Jordan when we were talking about how Abraham in Fear and Trembling is caught between the ethical and religious spheres, is that if you just have your life in ethics, if you're constantly sort of renewing it as a result of ethical repetition, is that you realize that you are an individual who can't do it all. You can't solve all the ethical problems in the world. You cannot be ethically perfect all the time. And there's going to be a sense of remorse and guilt and dissatisfaction with yourself, just as there is a sense of remorse and guilt and dissatisfaction when you're recollecting within aesthetic categories. So I don't think it really came out that well here, or at least not in my reading of it, but I'm drawing from those other books of Either Or and Fear and Trembling, and I can tell you that the really, really genuine form of repetition isn't going to be ethical alone. It's going to be a religious thing, hence why Kierkegaard is going to bring in this conversation of Job.
So, I mean, let's think of it in the either or sense. Marry or don't marry, you'll regret it. So in the sense maybe with the young man, he was thinking, okay, love, I'm always going to feel loyal to this woman. And then one day he doesn't. She doesn't do something right, or she's too clingy, or something happens. And he feels like he cannot be as loyal to her, if we're thinking in the ethical sphere as being a good partner and maybe marriage, as far as that is concerned. So maybe, like you said, we have to yearn for this perfection, and yet we are not perfect. And in that sense of deprivation, like you said, we feel despair and we feel guilty, yet we can't control it. Yet he can't try to love her again. He can't try to say, okay, well, besides that, in despite of all that, I'm going to try to love you anyway. He can't change it. And in not changing it, he wants to try to get free of it. And this is where we have Constantine trying to give him all these different exits. But the young man feels like there is no exit in some sense.
He does. He starts to think of himself. The young man starts to think of himself like Job, that he's undergoing some religious ordeal, and he kind of surrenders it and kind of lets God decide it for him, and then whatever's returned to him, like that will be the actual repetition. Does he get Isaac back? Does he get the girl back? And in this situation, we know that he doesn't get her back.
No.
And he's like, but he rejoices anyway because he's like, I got myself back. He's like, myself got to be integrated as a result of this religious ordeal. I went through the spiritual ordeal and I became this new person who with greater integration of myself.
And that is the penultimate chapter within the story before the outro by Constantine, where the young man realizes, oh, she just got married to another man, and he is overjoyed by this. And
why do you think Constantius is overjoyed?
Oh, I'm sorry. I mean the young man.
Well, I also think Constantius might be happy about it too, because I think he probably sees something of himself in the young man and thinks and is generally skeptical of marriage in general, and probably wanted something. Probably was orchestrating things in such a way that the young man would sabotage his engagement, and that he maybe thinks that there's something. I'm purely speculating here, but maybe he thinks that there's something greater for this young man now that he won't be burdened by marriage.
Sure, and I think the thing to note is that this kid, this young man, we have come to the conclusion that he is waiting. He put it into God's hands, correct? That he thinks it's not going to be an accident. But it turns out that the girl gets married, and I think Constantine even says it too, where he says, well, he thought he was in control of this, or he thought that he had some kind of struggle. I mean, you said he compared himself to Job, right? Mm-hmm. So to me, that almost implies that the young man thinks that there's some grander narrative within his story, but then it's just an accidental thing. The girl finds another man and gets married. Yeah, and that it's not within his control. It's not within the individual relationship between him and God. It's just this thing that happens on the side, this temporal flux thing that happens. And that maybe that is the limit to the ethical as well, is that it's not hinged on the individual, which I think you were getting at. It's not hinged upon the individual. It is hinged upon the temporalness sometimes of society, that we want to be a good person, but sometimes little accidents happen, and that they aren't done for a greater purpose necessarily, but they are, again, accidents.
Yeah, it's hard for me to understand. I feel like the young man is being melodramatic by analogizing himself to Job.
He's getting a bigger narrative.
But I mean, maybe we can see how his story would fit into Job. And I think we should talk about Job a little bit and how that relates to what I think Kierkegaard believes is the authentic religious repetition. So just to kind of like brush up on our Bible here, Job was this upstanding man, very incredibly dedicated to God, and somehow God and the devil get into this conversation about Job, and God says, "Oh, hey Satan, have you considered my servant Job? He is just the best, isn't he?" And Satan says something to the effect of, "Well, he only loves you so much because you've blessed him so much." And God's like, "Huh."
Wager.
He's like, you know what? I'll take you up on that, Satan. So God removes his protection from Job and says to Satan, do what you want with Job, just don't kill him. Right? And so Satan just he kills off his family members through a variety of different means, destroys all his properties, afflicts Job with like boils and sickness or whatever. And in this process, all of Job's friends are saying, you must have sinned. You must have done something to make God so angry at you that he would let this happen. But Job knows that he's blameless. Job knows that he's done everything he can in accordance with law and ethics to be an upstanding man. And so they start saying to him, admit your sin or curse God. Like one or the other is going on here. And he refuses to curse God. He weathers this ordeal in silence, not unlike Abraham as he ascends to Mount Moriah and is prepared to sacrifice Isaac. He refuses to blame God. All he says is that he curses the day that he was born. That's all. That's the only sort of outrage that he has. He doesn't take God to court and says, God, it was unjust for you to do this. He still clings to God because he's so dedicated to God. And in this ordeal, Job grows closer to God. He proves that his dedication wasn't based on externalities, that was really based on the relationship that he has with God. And God rewards Job, even though Job does not make the calculation. God replenishes everything that the devil took away. He gives him back all. He gives them the same number of children back. I believe they're even better looking than the previous children. I think that's how the story goes.
Some 2.0.
Yeah. It's like, yeah, this is a massive upgrade. Jimmy was kind of hideous, and this Jimmy, Jimmy 2.0, he's going to totally be the quarterback of the team. And he gives him back. He gets all his land back. Everything comes back in a double fold. There's this repetition. The past is repeated in a more valuable way. And
so what is the thing that is repeated, I think, is the interesting part. Is it the subservience to God, to a divine authority? Is the relationship with God something that transcends even human relationships, like we were talking about before, the ethical, and even within marriage? Is it a relationship with God that transcends just the ephemeral world? Is that what is repeated over and over again, even within the pain and the anguish that then is given its just due, like you said, and we get Jimmy 2.0? Is that it, perhaps?
The repetition seems to be the renewal of the commitment to God, and that this is the right form of repetition, whereas the repetition to the ethical had limitations. Correct. Whereas the repetition to God not only allows us to weather complex ordeals with the best sort of dignity that we can, but ultimately we're prepared to receive back whatever God gives us. I think Job says something to the effect of, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. I think that's where that comes from, is in the Job story. And so ultimately,
the what is constant? It is his.
What is constant is the relationship with God, and what's repeated is not only the commitment to God, but the doubling up of whatever he expected in the temporal realm.
So the religious repetition acts on many different levels.
Probably. Whereas the aesthetic repetition left us hollow. We can't retrace our steps. The ethical repetition led us feeling lacking and limited in some way. And recollection has a form of despair in it because we're remembering something that's dead and gone, or we're realizing the limits of our ability to cognize the universe. And the thing is, Constantius can't understand Job. Constantius says he can't get his mind around authentic, genuine repetition. He is somehow outside of it. That's why Kierkegaard doesn't sign this directly, because this isn't like his authentically Christian point of view. This is written to somebody who perhaps is familiar with what one needs to do to be a Christian, or someone that's familiar with sort of the limitations of love loss and either ethical performance or whatever, but can't take that move, that can't be like Job, can't be like Abraham just yet.
So that's a repetition, dare I say, of the idea of the pseudonym for Kierkegaard almost being a thing that he can't exactly reach. Like we said before, he doesn't even know if he's a Christian. He doesn't say he is a Christian, but the pseudonyms work in a way to even admit and to emphasize that he has not attained this religious sphere, whether it be in repetition or in his relationship with God or Christianity.
Or it's to say that he has bypassed the universal. He has bypassed the ethical universal and has become the religious individual, and now has enough leverage over those prior existence stages to talk about them as if they're characters in a novel.
Right.
Yeah, so I think...
But it's this transparency and this ambiguity that leaves us questioning that intention in regards to Kierkegaard. But I think we are left with this dialectic of repetition, of all these different repetitions going, and seeing that, not necessarily seeing that one wins out, but there's one that is an authentic repetition in the truest sense of the definition.
And Constantius can't do it. Constantius can't make the movement. I shared this quote on my Facebook. I don't know if you saw it, but I really thought this is pretty poetic. Because so Constantius is in. He's bypassed. He doesn't have time for women and marriage and all of that. So he kind of lives in this cerebral realm, and I think this is Constantius. I hope it's not. I'm not misquoting it. It doesn't. It's Kierkegaard via one pseudonym or the other. But he says on page 222, he says, 3 cheers for the dance in the vortex of the infinite. 3 cheers for the cresting waves that hide me in the abyss.
That was the young man at the end.
Oh,
that
that's
was
the
his
young
final
man.
letter when he says, I'm free, I'm free.
He's like, well, the young man, okay, so the young man is free from his ethical obligation to marry. So he can just dwell completely in recollection. He can, and I think about this, like, I probably do this, like, in the sense that I probably, like, read and study so much in a way to isolate myself from the world, right? In a way, as a sort of as a form of escapism. I think I must do this in some way because of some hurt that I experienced in the past, as a way of, like, a Band-Aid or a bandage over some sort of past hurt. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if the young man is doing something similar. And if he's deluding himself by thinking he has really made the authentic repetition that's necessary to do in faith. But I think it's kind of interesting to think about, like, so we've talked about, like, what that repetition looks like in terms of what it's doubling up of. It's a doubling up of the commitment to God. It's a doubling up of loving, just as Abraham did, loving God, yet loving the temporal realm, and whatever God gives us, we're going to be content with. So there's this reduplication there too, right? But how this works itself out in the love story of the young man, like, does he really make the religious repetition? What do you think? Do you think he really approximates Job?
We don't really know.
Yeah, what do you think?
We?
I don't know.
That
I couldn't
ending,
tell. I thought it was
that's the last line of the young man that we hear that you just read.
Yeah, I mean, because where's the religious for the young man? Like, where
he was a poet through and through.
Yeah,
and you're talking about either or. We're talking about the aesthete, the poet. Where, I don't really know if it was a religious connection. Maybe, as we have discussed on the difference between the genius and apostle, perhaps the young man was reading into the Job story in an aesthetic point of view, correct? He wasn't actually reading into it as a religious repetition, that maybe he was looking at it in a way of like, okay, I'm going to go through some pain now, and then the young man's going to tell himself, well, I went through this pain, and guess what? I feel better. It must have been a religious repetition. The thunderstorm happened, and I feel better. But, like you said...
Where's God in this equation?
Exactly. He's not there.
I don't think he's
the
there.
Abyss. I think it's really important to note the abyss part. Can you read that again?
Yeah. 3 cheers for the dance in the vortex of the infinite. 3 cheers for the cresting waves that hide me in the abyss.
Hide me in the abyss.
Well, you don't...
Vortex of the infinite. How vague. That almost sounds like Hegel talk if Hegel was a poet.
Yeah, I mean, you don't... If you have an authentic contact with God, you're not calling it vortex or abyss. You don't think of... If you're having a contact with God, you're having... It's more like you're touching the foundation of all being. You don't call the foundation of all being an abyss or a vortex.
Or you just don't even say anything, like you referred to in the Fear and Trembling lecture, Johann di Silencio, right?
You're not boasting about it.
You're not going to boast about it. You're going to keep silent. And now I'm wondering if this is a example of an aesthetic view of repetition or of religious repetition in that way, that perhaps the young man thinks he's being religious, but he's not. Like you said, he's back at square one. Would you agree with that? The ending, he's back at square one, that, okay, I am now unbounded by the ethical sphere, and now I'm back into the aesthetic.
It seems like he's still trapped within the immanental realm. It doesn't seem like he actually enters into transcendence, because he has made similar movements to Job, where he resigns and gives up, and is sort of he says he's okay with whatever is returned to him. Mm-hmm. But, like, if there isn't God in the mix, the transcendent isn't in the mix, he's really just imperfectly aping what Job and Abraham and really every authentically existing Christian goes through.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like to me he has if we understand the young man's plight well, which we could be misunderstanding given the convoluting nature of the way that this book is written over a series of correspondences, it would seem like to me he has only superficially made a repetition, and that his repetition is not ethical but aesthetic. That it would be, I don't know if you want to say that it's like he's pretending to be a Job, but he's not really Job. It's not an aesthetic in the same way that Constantius tells us about how he retraces his steps to Berlin. He's superficially retracing Job's steps without making the authentic repetition in the process.
And what is not making that authentic? That he does not have his relationship with God?
Yeah, if you don't have God in the mix, you can't have authentic repetition.
So that's the vacuum, I suppose,
of
the ethical and of the aesthetic, is that since we do not have that God in the equation, then it is a river that does not repeat itself. But if we have God, then there's this stream that is always constant and never changing. And even if maybe the world around it is constantly changing, that this river, opposed to the Heraclitus River, is a constant river.
Yeah, well, there's like, I think about it maybe like on two, I think of it as like parallel timelines. Like there being like sort of like an eternal sort of vantage point, an eternal consciousness. Mm-hmm. And then like sort of us caught up within the flux of time. And maybe if I had a better understanding of like the division between the Eleatics and the Heraclitean view, I could talk about what the Eleatics stood for, but I can't really say for certain. Because they were the ones that were interested in saying that motion didn't exist.
Exactly, like the Zeno paradox sort of thing. Where
and then like the person refuted them by walking back and forth.
Diogenes, I think, he just sees, repetition doesn't exist, motion doesn't exist, and he just walks back and forth. And he says,
I like how you got up and walked away, because that'll give it like an old timey radio feel. It'll be like have like a radio show from the 30s where they didn't have any effects. No. You just walked in the background. Yeah, who's at the door?
Heraclitus.
I am Heraclitus, resurrected for Noetic. Them damn Eleatics.
Yeah.
The way that I see this is that Job has a stabilizing point out of the Heraclitean flux of existence, the river of time. I guess maybe it would be like in Abraham. Abraham has his consciousness eternally validated because he concentrates the loci of all his being around God. Mm-hmm. It's almost like these are like rocks in the river of time, right? So like that we have some point that we can kind of remain tethered to as all these supplanting moments of time and consciousness go through.
So then I wonder,
God acts as a tethering point for us, or something. So then
I wonder whether these other spheres, the aesthetic and the ethical, if we want to use the Hegel sense too, if we want to vaguely mention Hegel here, where he sees this flux and he says, "Oh, well, I can explain it." Is that another tether, or do they think, "Oh, I know where the river is going. Let's follow it and see what happens because I know what's going to happen"? Is it a false tether? The aesthetic or a Hegel, a philosophical, ethical, whatever.
I mean, I think Kierkegaard would say they're all false. And I think that the problem is with Hegel...
Are they trying to be anchors, or are they more so like canoes trying to say, "Oh, I know what the path is," and then try to go with the flux and then instead just get crashed? If
we're mixing all these metaphors or whatever, I think Hegel, if history is a river... then I would say Hegel believes that he has a map of that river, of that canoe trip. But then the thing is that a lot of people use the point to refute Hegel is that there are a lot of things that didn't fit into Hegel's narrative of history, like he was selective about what he used in his methodology to explain what he's doing. And we have to really do something separately with Hegel to understand how Kierkegaard was responding to that.
Sure, but
further, the prognosticating effects. Could Hegel have predicted... Does Hegel really understand what the future is going to be? And how is the future proven or not proven, Hegel? But I really feel like I probably shouldn't be speaking to that because it's outside my realm of expertise right now. But I think Hegelians think they have the big picture.
Sure. Well, let's not even say Hegelians. Let's say aesthetes. Let's say ethical, where maybe people have these systems, whether it be an artist system or a philosopher system or an ethicist system, that other people have these ideas of where this river is going, that they think that is constant, but it isn't, because it is subject to change. And if you don't have anything that is grounded, like a relationship with God or Jesus Christ, that you can't know for sure where the river is going at all.
No. So, I think a lot of people who, like a lot of air quote ethicists or whatever, believe they have some sort of roadmap. But the whole point of the Job story and the Abraham story is to show the limitations of ethics. So I think Kierkegaard would say that those people are misguided in their understanding of how things ought to be, because we have biblical instantiations that automatically refute ethics. Like Abraham is a refutation of ethics because he's willing to sacrifice his son. Job is a refutation of ethics because, like,
he's a good person and they have bad things happen to him, yet he's still a good person.
By ethics, he would be entitled to blame God for what's going on from the ethical perspective, but he understands the limitations of the ethical perspective, that he will not blame God for his situation.
And it's all wrapped around this relationship with God, both of these Old Testament stories.
Yeah.
And I think that is the crux in this religious repetition, or the good repetition that we're talking about.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I don't know. I think we covered it pretty well. Considering I've never had this conversation before, except for, just over dinner a little bit here, I think it went pretty well. I don't know how much more I have to say, though.
I'm curious about
the
implications of knowing about the aesthetic and the ethical repetition in regards to our daily life. Because I remember in previous podcasts, you have said that reading Kierkegaard and understanding him isn't necessarily about leaving the aesthetic sphere, leaving the ethical sphere, or leaving those things behind, but it's about seeing them in a different way. So, with repetition, are we saying that, okay, we have to know that the ethical and the aesthetic are not constants in our life, and the only thing that is constant is a relationship with God in a paradoxical religious relationship, and that is the only thing that is constant. Therefore, we should treat these other things, even though we still love them, we cannot idolize them as these constant things in our life, or as these things that will always give us comfort, always give us enjoyment, always give us direction.
I think Kierkegaard would say that they can all be constant, right? Our devotion to music can be constant till the day we die. Our devotion to a certain ethical paradigm can be constant till the day we die.
So what is the caveat then?
Is that to make those constants, to make aesthetic inspiration, to make ethical inspiration, sorry, just blocking off the camera here, to make those the loci of our being, is to participate in probably what Kierkegaard or Kierkegaard commentators would say a form of subjective madness. We treat them as gods, but they ultimately end up committing us to some sort of existential bankruptcy in one form or the other. And the only way that we really reconcile ourselves with the world is if there's this triangulation that goes on where God is the middle term, where God enters into it. That's the only way we are going to be at home in the world, and that we're going to have our self healed. Otherwise, if we deify the ethical stance, if we deify the aesthetic stance, then there is going to be anxiety, despair, dread, and a host of other existential problems, a panoply of problematic emotions in those things. It doesn't mean we give up on music after we have the religious contact. It doesn't mean that we give up on ethics after we have the religious contact. We just know that our whole life is not based in aesthetics or in the ethical. That ultimately the loci of all being is in the religious relationship, and we can still participate in these realms, but we have to keep that attitude the same.
That triangulation.
That triangulation has to be
that's
there.
really great that you mentioned that, because if we think of the ethical sphere in regards to marriage, what is it in the Catholic Church? A holy matrimony, correct? That God is part of that union, and that perhaps, if we wanted to look at it in some way, marriage as a sacrament is the ethical transformed into the religious repetition, perhaps. Or maybe it's an odd combination, or maybe it is completely the religious because God is thrown in there and he is this constant relationship.
Right. There's the sense, right, that if the marriage is really going to endure, that God needs to be in there.
Death till us part.
Yeah.
Sense.
And actually, Kierkegaard takes up this idea, I believe, more exclusively, or more explicitly, I should say, in Works of Love.
I would imagine.
He's going to address that issue. He's going to talk about how if God is not a part of this triangulation, that you're going to have selves kind of cling to each other like this with such an incredible intensity that it actually, like, there's this idealization of romantic love that, like, these that you're supposed to be these Siamese twins that are like can't be separated from one another, but because you have so much passion for one another that ought to be for the infinite, it's actually what's going to be the thing that drives you mad. And the only way to have a marriage that is sustainable is if people are constantly being humbled and coming back down to earth as a result of this relationship with God. It's going to be another form of subjective madness if we put all our passion and all our subjectivity into a person when that really ought to be for the divine person.
So then let's take that into the aesthetic sphere, like somebody, Johann Sebastian Bach, for instance, who was a deeply religious man. He was writing for the church for the most part and was deeply devoted to his faith. And it is said, and I think it is true, that after every work he wrote for the glory of God. That was always.
I do it, man.
At the part
I've taken a cue from Anselm. Like Anselm, I used to think it was really weird when I would read Anselm, and he would like pray before he did like philosophy and stuff like that. I'm just like before we did the podcast tonight or whatever, I was like, oh God, please like give me enough insight that I can kind of communicate this the best of my ability.
Yeah, but think of the prolificness of a Bach or an Anselm, or of what we're doing right now. That if we are, like you said, like what Kierkegaard said, if we are constantly our work and us, and if we're smashed together with our work and us, and there's nothing separating it, nothing like a triangulation, there's no God, then we are completely involved in this temporal, non-repeating thing that will not last. I mean, granted, like you said, we can love music all our lives, but it's not going to be that quote-unquote lasting relationship like we have with God, or it's not going to give us satisfaction away from the existential crisis or despair or anything like that. So I think that's really, really profound, if I may use the word. I know we bashed it in.
I didn't bash it.
Kierkegaard bashed it, at least in of a difference between a genius and an apostle.
Oh yes.
But I think it's a profound statement to say if you have that relationship with God, then you can participate, like you said, participate in these different spheres, but have an entirely different relationship. A new relationship is formed. You're not just doing music, but you're doing music within this relationship of you, God, and the aesthetic. Or you're having a relationship with you, your spouse, who you're married to, and God. So I think the religious sphere, like you said, I think like what we're getting at here is a means of charging these relationships that we have, or giving them this meaning. I think that's what we're getting at. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean, look, they come to have a different meaning. I mean, the meaning is, like, I mean, it's hard to say what exactly the meaning is, but, and again, these are going to be taken up in some of the works that are in the second authorship, is that, like, when you have actually had that authentic conversion, repetition, or whatever you were going to say about Soren Kierkegaard, is that you view people differently. and you view the way that you approach them differently. You are supposed to be sort of an imitation of the grace that is given to you. And so that's why there's sort of this overflowing of love to other individuals. That if you're properly triangulated with God or whatever, like it's going to be much easier to love your wife than if you just had based on like romantic love. And it's going to be much easier to love the neighbor and even people that do you tremendous wrong. I'd be interested. I want to know more about how Kierkegaard views like, because it's a struggle for me to get my head around. I can understand how people have a renewed sort of meaning after one makes the religious conversion, but I'd really like to know how he views philosophy and art, how we're supposed to handle those things. Like how do we use those? Ought they to be things that we just approach in a different way, or should we actively use them in some way to glorify the relationship? Because there's all that.
Because we think of like a Bach, like we said before,
yeah,
who wrote church cantatas and masses.
Inspiration is one thing, but like the celebration and promulgation of the idea is a little bit different. You know what I'm saying? Like, should I be using philosophy right now to spread the gospel? Should I be using music to spread the gospel? Like,
yes, when does it become a distorted evangelization?
Yeah. Like, it kind of gets a little bit like
narcissistic. Where does the silence play in too, correct? Where does the silence play into this? Can you have this relationship and still be a rock and roll artist, or can you still be a poet, but not necessarily tell people about your religious experience or your religious relationship, your religious repetition? Or is it something that will just emanate from yourself already? Or, as we discussed in the present age, do you have to kind of be a invisible cop? The
plainclothes cop. Yeah, I think it has to come out naturally, you know, like like with the plainclothes cop who's like sitting in a diner having a cup of coffee, and then the robber comes in. Like, the cop's not being, the whole time, the cop is not
I am a cop,
hello. He's like, I'm the cop here. He's not doing that. But when the moment comes where he has to do the thing he's ordained to do, he takes out the robber, or he prevents the thievery. So maybe it's like that. Maybe you're not broadcasting it at all the time, but when the moment happens, you step in and you do. And then people learn there.
Then that badge is the relationship with God. That is the repetition. That
like Clark Kent and Superman.
He always has the Superman uniform. Yeah. That is the religious repetition, I believe. That he wears that uniform every day, and that when the moment happens, he's going to break it out.
It's interesting. It's interesting. We talk about Superman typically in regards to Nietzsche because of the Ubermensch, but I wonder how we could use Superman to talk about repetition and
maybe in that way. I've tried to think of repetition in an analogous way, and perhaps that is something. Or if we go back to the Odyssey, where Ulysses is always the king of Ithaca, or the ruler of Ithaca, yet he's far away from home, and he's still struggling to get home, and people still know him. His wife still knows that he is the king of Ithaca. There's this thing that isn't exactly a permanent thing. He doesn't have a crown necessarily, but he is the king. He has this relationship with his people and with his home. And maybe that thing, that Clark Kent, that costume under, that kingship, which is the thing that is constant throughout any ordeal that Ulysses goes through in the Odyssey, or what Superman goes through, or even what we go through in a normal day-to-day life, that relationship with God is the thing that is constant. And if we have to whip it out, we whip it out. But there's something about having it that emanates through anything we do.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we got it, man. I think we got it. We're at like a minute or an hour 8, so probably should bring it to a close.
No, that's no problem. Did you have any closing thoughts? Because I think we
covered it, man.
Really,
I think we got it. I mean, I'm sure I'll listen back to it and I'll be like, oh man, I left that on the table. But I think we got it. I think we got it.
That's okay. Yeah, I think the implications that we received from it at the end, I think, were enlightening to me. I didn't really think of repetition in this way until we started talking. And I think it's this idea of thinking while you're talking, or where you just come up with different things that you didn't even know before. And perhaps that's just something more people should do, is just to talk about these things, especially as much as the religious is a personal thing, I believe a lot of it comes out through talking to people about it. I know I've had a lot of great interlocutors and friends who have guided me in ways that I didn't really know, or who gave my solitude and my individuality in regards to my relationship with God and religion a different flavor. Just as Kierkegaard is now, just as talking to you about Kierkegaard is now, that having these conversations, even if it's between ourselves, as Kierkegaard does, if we have to balance that in our heads, that's okay. But I think talking to it with different people is very beneficial, and at least I've got something from this conversation.
I mean, the biggest thing for me is that, look, I'm sure this is not going to be the last time we talk about repetition. I imagine that we will have experts that come in and weigh in on repetition eventually as we develop the Noetic product. I think it is kind of cool. Like I found myself not having to be as dependent upon my notes, and actually think maybe we understood it a little bit better than I thought we would, considering how convoluting it is. But we'll let the people decide, and maybe they'll be like, man, they totally messed that up. But we'll see. Yeah, vote. Text it in to Philosophy Idol, and we'll see what the people have to say. All right, man. I gotta move on to the next thing. I gotta get caught up in that Heraclitus stream of existence.
No problem. Thank you all for listening.
All right, see you guys. It's a Noetic recording 2016. Don't steal it. They're probably gonna steal it now.